Good evening. Welcome to our Energion Tuesday night hangout. I'm Henry Neufeld. I'm the owner of Energion Publications. And tonight I'm going to be talking with Dr. Bob. He wears a number, but the relevant one tonight is author of the recently study guide on marriage titled Marriage in Interesting Times. So welcome, Bob.
Good evening.
Hey. I want to start this out with the kind of going to the heart of the question. This is part of Marriage in Interesting Times is a participatory study guide, which is a series we do that really takes entries from a variety of theological perspectives. But let's start out. If somebody as a pastor or an education coordinator is wanting to talk about marriage in the church, what are the advantages? What reasons would they have to select your study guide as the tool for that study?
Well, I would say this, and we can start with the title, Marriage in Interesting Times. We're living at a time when people are concerned about the state of marriage, especially in the light of the Supreme Court decision a year ago. What does marriage look like in the days to come? There are those who would say that there is a biblical form of marriage, but if you read the Bible, you find that's not true. So the question that I pose, and what I think this study guide allows a group to do, or a person to do, is ask the question, what does the Bible have to say that provides wisdom for people today when it comes to marriage? So what does it have to say to us? Not whether there is a biblical form of marriage, which is probably 1950s nuclear family, but what can we find in the Bible that will be useful for us as we contemplate what marriage is supposed to be today and in the future? That's kind of what I would say.
Okay, well, you've opened up several areas for fruitful conversation. We're going to continue to talk about this book. Again, the book is Marriage in Interesting Times, a participatory study guide. The author is Dr. Bob Cornwall. And I will note that I have on the showcase, if you want to get to the website for this, I do have a link to the book's catalog page, as well as the standard links for our YouTube channel and Google Plus page. And I will be activating the Q&A app, which is there. So if you want to present any questions, if you're on YouTube, there should be a banner across the bottom that you need to click in order to, it'll read join the conversation. That'll let you get involved in these interactive elements of the Google Hangout. Let's start with the one, since biblical studies is more my area. I've often said that the less you know about the Bible, the easier it is to describe something as biblical. So you say there isn't a, quotes, biblical form of marriage. Could you kind of expand on this? What is there in the Bible? Just kind of outline of what you're looking at.
So when you read the Bible, and if you're looking for passages that talk about what we'll call marriage, you find a variety of forms of marital relationship. You have Abraham, who's married to Sarah, but Sarah isn't able to bear a child, and so she gives him her handmaiden, Hagar. Now, Hagar bears a child. So is Hagar his wife? A concubine? Is it polygamy? Abraham's the father of our faith. Think of Jacob. Jacob wants to marry Rachel. Well, what happens? He goes into the tent after the big celebration, and he gets up the next morning and discovers that it's not Rachel in his bed, but Leah. Now, he had hoped to marry Rachel, and eventually he will marry Rachel, along with 2 other people, to make 4 wives. So is that a biblical form of marriage? David has multiple wives. Solomon has multiple wives. So we see throughout Scripture there are multiple forms of what is acceptable marriage. By the first century, it does appear that monogamy of some sort is the norm. But even there, what kind of marriage relationship are we finding? It's hard to know for sure, but for the most part, marriages were arranged in the ancient world. In fact, they were arranged by families up until recently, maybe up until the 18th century, and still are being arranged in some parts of the world. Marriage had less to do with love and relationship or even procreation, though that's part of it, but more often they had to do with connecting people's to families for the purposes of building property and then passing on to an heir. And so what we think of marriage today in terms of a personal romantic relationship, that really wasn't on the minds of the people in the ancient world. Now, that's not to say there weren't loving, relating relationships. It's just that wasn't the prime reason to get married. And so when we look at all of these things, we say there really isn't one form of marriage. At the same time, when we look at the Bible, there are a number of texts that speak of relationships, including marital relationships, that we can draw from today that I think are valuable for our conversation so that we can grow in our understandings in support of marriage. Because I believe in marriage. I just don't think there's a biblical form of marriage, that at least one biblical form that we can point to and say, there it is.
Now, you address this in another one of your books, also in the Participatory Study Series, in your book on Ephesians, when you get to the household codes. One of the differences there is to talk about what is the definition of family, what is the definition of household. So really, as well as defining marriage here, an American 1950s mom and dad and one boy and one girl picture from the 50s would not be exactly the image of a household or of a family that would be in mind, say, in Ephesians 5 and so on.
Correct. Yes. And so it's hard for us to create a one-to-one relationship any more than it is to say that most marriages today, I've been married for 33 years. The marriage relationship that I have with Cheryl is a whole lot different than perhaps my parents had and their parents. I'm old enough to have watched Leave It to Beaver and other shows like that. But that kind of a family structure is pretty rare today. I mean, it does exist, but it's really not the norm. And so when we're trying to connect over 2,000 years or 3,000 years, then we should expect that the differences are pretty stark. And so households in the ancient world were much broader than simply mom, dad, and the kids. It was grandparents. It was if you had other people living in the household, servants, slaves, whatever. I think in terms of Cornelius, the story of Cornelius and his household converts. What makes up that household? Probably a whole lot more than he and his wife, and if he had any kids. But and then there's a patriarchal structure that's present in the ancient world that, at least in my circles, would not be acceptable.
So one of the things that you're doing in the book, in the study guide, is trying to guide the readers, and this is probably a guide that is very much best used with at least a few people to discuss with at some time or another. Although it could be read individually, but still there's that need to exchange. But what you're doing is trying to help people draw the connection. What are the principles of relationships? What are the principles that make up a family or other personal relationship that can apply in the 21st century?
Right. So let's take it for example. It's right up there in one of the early chapters. Is the Genesis 2 passage. So what does Genesis 2 tell us? Well, if we really look at it closely, because it's used a lot in the conversation, the issue isn't about being fruitful or multiply. Actually, that's really not even part of the conversation in Genesis 2 till way later. What it is that God creates the man and looks at the man and discovers that the man is lonely. And not even the relationship between God and Adam is sufficient. And so God tries to find a helper fit for him and brings all kinds of animals to Adam, but none of those fit. And finally, God puts Adam to sleep and takes the rib, is what we usually think of, and creates a partner fit for him. And Adam wakes up and recognizes the person. He doesn't name her, interestingly enough, but he recognizes her as being bone of his bone, flesh of his flesh, one like him, one who is fit for him. And so the issue there isn't procreation. Oh, now we need to be fruitful and multiply. It's that the man is lonely. The man needs a partner, needs a helper that is fit for him. And so God provides that. So what is the key point in that first passage? It's about relationship and about an intimate relationship. Now, the question that goes further, and what I try to raise in the book, from my perspective as one who, and you don't have to buy into the marriage equality to read the book or use the book, but I come at it from that perspective, is that whoever it is, who is the one who is the fit companion for us that fills that role, and I think it takes place in a variety of ways, not just that intimate husband-wife relationship or husband-husband, wife-wife relationship, but all kinds of relationships that are human, that are relational. But the primary, there is the connection that we have, and we need each other. That's the primal. That's the primary purpose, out of which all the other elements develop. But it's interesting that God recognized the man was lonely and needed a companion that was fit for him, and then created and took care of the problem, in essence. And then we move forward. Now, it takes on a lot of forms after that.
It's an interesting point there, and that I'd like you to respond to. Although first a comment, I think probably Genesis 2, I think probably gets read more as serious propositional theology than it's intended, where it's very much in the form of story, and there's a certain amount of humor going on there too. You know, with the picture of God bringing each animal to Adam and saying, "Hey, would this work?"
You're right.
Yeah, there's a certain, but here's the point that I'd like to raise is, for a lot of people, Genesis 2 is what really defines the biblical family. I think that's probably what, when people aren't thinking of 1950s suburban life in the United States, they're thinking, here's Adam, here's Eve, and they're put together, and that's really the ideal family, as opposed to, say, you get into Genesis 4 and Lamech, who gets himself 2 wives, and so they see that as a kind of a perversion of what was going on in Genesis 2. It's probably a little harder to say that when it's Abraham or Jacob who are taking the extra wives. But how would you respond to that, where somebody sees this as, this is the ideal, everything else is a failure to meet the ideal?
Well, I would add simply that, fine, let's go with that. But there is, in that conversation, they're supposed to take care of the garden and be together and be in fellowship with God, but they're not having any kids.
Yeah,
And
until after the
so
fall.
that doesn't happen until actually after the fall. Actually, they don't have any children to Genesis 3, and then everything goes haywire. So maybe the intention of God was never to have children, because we should stay in the garden and just tend the garden, and there should have been the two of them, and there's no more. I mean, so I don't know that that works very well, ultimately. But
Okay,
it's the issue. We have to see the humor. And part of what I try to do in the book is not to necessarily give all the answers. When I was writing the book initially, I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about the book, its title, and where I was going with it. And he was pushing me to be more directive in what I was writing. And I told him that wasn't the purpose. The purpose was not for me to give my own personal perspective on this, and saying this is the right way, but rather it is to encourage a conversation. Now that conversation can happen in groups, and it can happen internally. And part of the reason I wrote the book was because my own congregation was in the midst of having a conversation about welcoming gays and lesbians into the congregation, and further what that meant for marriage. And that became even more an important issue, of course, when the Supreme Court ruled opening up marriage across the country to gay and lesbian couples. So the question then is, what is marriage? So but the legal definition of marriage has changed in the United States. Now, churches and congregations have their right to define marriage however they wish, but as time goes on, this is going to become a more and more important conversation in the congregations, because even in congregations that do not allow same-sex marriage, their young people, by and large, are going to start asking the question of why not? And they can't just simply say, well, this is the way it always has been. Because when you look at the Bible, you can't say that it's always been this way or that way, because there have been multiple ways that we've experienced the relationship. I think it goes back to Genesis 2. I think what I take from Genesis 2 is the key point is the importance of relationship. That's what that chapter is about. But it's not the only chapter in text. We can also have the conversation about what Jesus says, that in heaven, in the next life, in the kingdom, there is no giving of marriage. Marriage in Jesus's vision seems to be less important. He devalues marriage and family and calls, what is the family for Jesus? It's the community he gathers around him. People come and say, where's, your mother and your brothers are coming to talk to you. And he says, my mothers and brothers, and interesting, he never talks about his father, are these people who are my followers. So he devalues the family in one level. And so when we as Christians are saying, family values is most important thing, and Jesus says, hold on, folks, that's not quite true. There is more to it than that.
Okay, so would it be accurate here to say that while you support marriage equality, your purpose in the book was not to argue your position, but rather to facilitate an open discussion of various aspects of marriage?
Right. So I'm asking the question, what does the Bible have to say to us that is of value, that speaks on matters of marriage in all of its form? So there's a chapter in here about being single, about celibacy, and what does that mean? There's a chapter about divorce, because divorce is reality. And so how do we be pastoral? And how do we take a text where Jesus seems to say there is no room for divorce, and yet we have divorced people in our congregation? In fact, I would say that if you want to be prohibitive, it's more likely that divorced people shouldn't get married than gay people shouldn't get married. But that's a total other conversation. There is a chapter in there. Sex doesn't really, there's not a lot of passages that talk about the sexual relationship and how it's part of marriage. But you have the Song of Solomon, and even though traditionally we've kind of read that in ways that apply it allegorically, so that we don't have to deal with the reality that it's a very intimate and even erotic poem, but it's there, and it can allow us to have a conversation about the importance of the sexual relationship in marriage. So there's a lot of different conversation pieces that, if we look at texts that are there, there's a chapter that I utilize really from 1 Corinthians 7 that talks about equality in marriage. I don't think Paul's consistent in his views, but at the same time, there is the possibility of a view of marriage, of partnership, of mutuality that wasn't really primary in the culture. And whether Paul truly understand the full meaning of what he was teaching, I think today we can look at passages like 1 Corinthians 7 and reading Ephesians 5 in its fullness, where we can see that there is the possibility of understanding mutuality. So all of that is in the text of Scripture that we can attend to and have a conversation about what is marriage, why is it important for our communities today, and how do we address that? Because there's a lot of challenges to marriage in the modern context.
Well, I think there's an important point here to make, which is that in studying any topic biblically, we sometimes have the tendency to try to pick up all the texts as kind of data points and then say, okay, here's how we're going to put all these data points together into a single view here, where it is perhaps more like reading the story and finding out how you can relate to that.
Right, because because if we look at, let's say, I find it interesting. So one of the chapters takes us into later in Genesis, and it's the relationship of Jacob and Leah and Rachel. And I find it interesting is that Jacob ends up with Leah, and he's angry, and I would be angry if I had a switch like that. And so he goes to Laban, his father-in-law, and says, who's also his uncle. Yeah, this is interesting. And says, why did you do this? And Laban says, well, I don't know about where you come from, but in our place, the younger daughter doesn't get married before the older daughter. And so you can have Rachel, but you have to take Leah. Well, why does he have to take Leah before he can have Rachel? Because that's who he really wants. Well, in the ancient world, Leah, if Leah gets passed over for her younger sister, she's non-marriageable. No one will marry. They'll always ask, why is it that you're not married? And Laban has an investment in Leah as well as Rachel, but she's the oldest, so he has to get his money's worth. And so, but I find it interesting is that, and Laban's basically saying is that's not the way we do it around here, which tells me that there are cultural differences in the way marriages are arranged and experienced from culture to culture. What Jacob thought was important, which was his love for Rachel, was not what Laban thought was most important.
So it would also provide an interesting case where the love aspect runs headlong into the cultural aspect, and we see the development from there.
Right. So, I mean, we find, even today, we find, you know, two people fall in love, and their families are not really happy about the relationship. Well, why? Well, because the families don't see it as a proper match. And they're thinking in, you know, in maybe economic terms or cultural terms. I was having, just to give you an example, I was having a conversation with a Muslim friend of mine. He has a daughter and I have a son. I said, well, what would happen if one day my son fell in love with your daughter? How would that work? How would that work with your family? Because you and I are friends. Well, he said, that would be difficult. You see, so even if my son and his daughter did fall in love, the families, they might not approve of it. I don't think my family would. I mean, my extended family might have problems, and I know his extended family would have problems. Now, could the two get married? Sure. Could they have great lives together? Sure. Would they have to overcome certain biases in their families? Yes. Is it doable? Yes, but it's problematic.
Okay, and this sounds like a really excellent subject for an extended discussion. I recall somebody on Facebook right after we released the book, or just before we released the book, as a matter of fact, after some comment was made about it, saying, okay, so Energeon Publications is defining marriage. And as I pointed out then, I'm going to say now, I'm not trying to define anything. This study guide was one that I really strongly hope to have as a guide where people could discuss, preferably across the boundaries of this very various boundaries of this very controversial subject. So I certainly hope that it will be used in that way. We're talking with Bob Cornwall, his book, Marriage in Interesting Times. It's in our participatory study series. In the showcase right now, you can find the link to the catalog page. And I'd like to remind people that we do, on Energeon Direct, give some fairly substantial quantity discounts. So if you're looking for it for an educational program, be sure to look into that. And also, if you want to evaluate it, we will be happy if you'll provide us the information on what you're looking at it for. We will be happy to send you an evaluation copy free of charge. Bob, let me give you a chance here. We're running out of time. If you have any concluding remarks, for me, thanks for being with us to talk about this important topic.
So I think I'll say this in closing, is that I approached and I wrote this book from the perspective of one who is a pastor of a congregation, who is I'll say a Bible teacher, though I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm a theologian. I have a doctorate in theology, but I don't have a doctorate in biblical studies. So I don't consider myself a scholar. So if you're looking for deeply scholarly works, you're going to have to follow the notes that I rely upon. But I'm a pastor, and I've been married for 33 years to the same person. And we have our ups and downs like all couples do. Any couple that says they never fight, I wonder if they ever talk. So what I want to do is offer this book as a conversation starter, because that's an important topic of our times. These are interesting times. And if we want to have marriage, strong marriages going forward, we need to have the conversation.
And let me underline that conversation on just about any topic. When a topic gets too controversial for us to have a conversation about it, we're in some serious trouble. So we hope that this will allow more conversation. Again, thanks, Bob. And
You're welcome.
that's it for tonight.
Thank you.